Turkey has launched its cross-border operation into northwestern Syria called Peace Spring to create a safe zone in the region to protect its national security and to clear the area after terrorists, after the US President Donald Trump decided to withdraw its troops from there. Well, it has raised many questions in the Western media, specifically about the perception of this operation. What will happen to the Daesh fighters in the region? What about the civilian casualties? And also the challenges lying ahead for the safe zone there. We will be asking it all to the senior advisor of the Turkish President, Gulnur Aybet. Well, thank you very much again for joining us, Gulnur Aybet, here on TRT World, and in such short notice and knowing how busy you are at the moment. Coming to that business, actually, you have been the voice in Western media, especially voicing the concerns of Turkey when it comes to its cross-border operation and about the misinformation in the Western media as the senior advisor to the Turkish president. So why is there such a perception when this is not such a sudden move?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, it shouldn't be perceived as a sudden move because we have been very clear. In fact, we're the only country in the region who's been involved in Syria who's had a very consistent policy. Everybody has not had a consistent policy at all, but we have. And we've always maintained that we will not allow a terror corridor on our border. Now, it looks like, you know, the YPG, which is equivalent to the PKK, which is a terrorist organization, they're one of the same, used the vacuum created by the Syrian war and also the fact that, unfortunately, the US military decided to arm them in their fight against ISIS. And they used that vacuum and that opportunity to gain a lot of land, actually, in northeast Syria. And they changed the demographics of that area, and they shaped it to form an almost sort of little statelet of their own, made out of a terrorist organization. Now, it was pretty obvious, I think, to the Americans and to everybody else that we were never, ever going to allow this to happen on our border, because we have been in a struggle, in a counterterrorism struggle with this terrorist organization, the PKK, since 1984, and thousands of our citizens and members of our armed services have been killed in the hands of this terrorist organization.
Well, that's exactly that, because this is not Turkey's first cross-border operation.
Exactly.
So Turkey's been quite clear about the facts before the operations that it did held, about the timings of the operations, and that it was all due to national security concern, as you mentioned, creating a safe zone there and clearing the region of the terrorists. But you've had some difficult times, especially the recent days, when it comes to journalists being quite harsh there and leading for the misinformation to be said. So why even assuming that it is to actually to create a terror corridor in the region? How is that kind of misperception?
Well, I think people outside of Turkey are very confused, because you have this, as you mentioned, this very large misinformation feeding into the Western mainstream media about Turkey, why Turkey's doing this operation, why this operation is sudden, as we know it isn't. Because when you actually read Western analysts, for example, who write about security in the Middle East, who've been following the situation closely, they've all recently been writing that, you know, this was bound to happen. This was something that was coming, that this American policy of arming one terrorist group to fight another was bound to hit a wall. So a lot of Western analysts who've been following this closely were aware, but the mainstream media were not. And this is a mystery to us. Why were they so ill-informed? Or why didn't they do their research properly? Or why did they just listen to the propaganda coming from this terrorist organization?
So when we're talking about the PKK is a recognized terrorist organization, terrorist group by the US and Europe. But when it comes to the YPG, on the other hand, the US and Europe are not naming it as the PKK, although we know that it is the branch of the PKK terrorist group. So why is there a different perception when it comes to the YPG?
I know, and you know, there's a lot of confusion about that in the West as well, because only yesterday there was a US State Department statement that said yes, we do understand Turkey does have legitimate security concerns because they've been in a fight with the PKK, which has killed thousands of Turkish citizens, and YPG is their Syrian affiliate. This is the American State Department admitting this. Previously, there was a Senate hearing where Senator Lindsey Graham was questioning then U.S. Secretary of Defense Ash Carter, and Lindsey Graham pushed Ash Carter and said, you know, do you admit that the YPG and PKK are affiliated? Are they the same organization? Ash Carter says yes, they are very close and they are affiliated. So, you know, even in the higher levels of American government, you have this admission that this is one and the same. And therefore, de facto, they are admitting that the YPG is a terrorist organization. However, because a branch of the US military, CENTCOM, have decided to work with the YPG, and they took advantage, I think, of this vacuum between two administrations to implement the policy they had in mind. And this was such an ill-conceived policy. I think it was unfair on the American people, and they lied to, I think, to the American public by saying that they were helping their allies, the Kurds, as they framed it, in a fight against ISIS. No, they were arming a terrorist group in Syria, which didn't really control that much land in the beginning, but they ended up controlling land. They ended up displacing people from their homes and changing the demography because America or CENTCOM armed them. And this has actually turned into a nightmare situation where the current American administration is actually very confused about what to do. Because on one hand, you have people calling them our allies, the Kurds, and they also know, they know very well that this is a terrorist organization and that this is a serious national security priority for their NATO ally, Turkey. So they're now in a pickle about this, and that's why President Trump made this decision to withdraw all troops from Syria. And the Western media also has this very, preconceived, image that we're going to go in there and change the demography. In fact, we're going to put it right. We're trying to put it right because all these people, including Arabs and Turkmens and Christians, the Syriac Orthodox Foundation here made a statement not so long ago that a lot of Syriac Orthodox people were forcibly displaced by the YPG, and the YPG forcibly recruited their children. And that's the other thing the YPG does. They forcibly recruit children as child soldiers. They displace people from their homes. They've completely demolished Arab and Turkmen villages. So all this spin about the YPG being this lovely little organization, which is very secular, which is like predominantly with women and all this is, absolute rubbish, because we know exactly what they do and who they are. But unfortunately, the Western media seems to have this really nice image about them, and then there seems to be this earnestness to demonize Turkey as the bad guy. And this is what I've been trying to explain on the Western media, that we actually have been saying for a very long time that this is what we do. Now the other...
While you're saying that, I think you also stated the fact that Turkey has fought alone for a long time when it comes to refugees, when it comes to the security at the border and fighting Daesh. So Turkey being accused now, especially when it comes to Daesh, because that's one of the criticisms of Daesh fighters being released and what will happen to them. So what are the facts there?
And there's a lot of ignorance, because when you talk on Western media and you say, look, we've already conducted 2 operations in North Syria, and they're like, really? They don't know about it. I'm just really baffled why people aren't doing any research. They're just taking preconceived ideas about Turkey and the operation, and they're just hurling it on you in a very aggressive way. But you're saying, look, if you want to listen to me, this is the facts. We've already done 2 operations. Look, we undertook Operation Euphrates Shield over 3 years ago because we were the one country in the region and in the coalition against Daesh who were suffering more from Daesh attacks than any other country. Remember that summer when we had the terrible attack in the airport and other places, and then the final straw came when Daesh blew up all these people in a wedding.
Well, coming from the operations from there to today, to the Peace Spring operation, we knew the timeframes were short and how long it will take in considering the days of it. But looking at this one, of course, we're talking about a much bigger area.
It's a bigger area.
The mission is to actually create a safe zone.
Yeah.
So what point is the operation at the moment?
Well, at the moment, I think it's actually going quite swiftly because we've already secured a major town, and now we're entering another major town on the border, and we've taken between those two towns at least 15 villages, and we've also the National Syrian Army, which is fighting with our armed forces. They've actually gone as far as the M4 highway, which is actually quite crucial because that's where all the logistical supplies are coming to this terrorist group. So I think, it's going very quickly, but as you mentioned, it's a much bigger area. Now, there's also a confusion when you talk to Western media about the scope of the operation. They're not sure what we're doing there. They don't know about our objectives. They don't know the scope. And the scope actually has been made very clear, in the United Nations General Assembly when President Erdogan was giving his speech. He even showed a map of it, of what it entailed. And when he had the telephone conversation with President Trump, that's what they agreed to, around 30 kilometers, 20 miles in depth, over 400 kilometers of length. And this is actually very clear because this is the area that is a national security threat to our country. So it has to be secured.
And we are talking about a war that has been continuing from 2011 onwards. So all the diplomatic channels have been used, haven't they?
Absolutely. And, we informed everybody about this. We tried to secure that border by working with our allies. Now, we worked with the Americans in Manbij. They promised us that the YPG would be cleared out of Manbij. That never happened. They did a few patrols with us, that's it. And then we started to work with the Americans again here on the northeast of Syria. And they assured us that the YPG would be withdrawn from our areas and so forth. But again, we could see that this was going not the way that we wanted it to. It wasn't going fast enough. We had a serious national security priority on our hands. So what we did was we had to take matters into our own hands at the end. We like to work with our allies. We prefer to work with our allies. But when they're not being sincere and honest with us, then what can we do? I mean, look at the way the Europeans are acting. They're actually more sympathetic to this terrorist group than they are to their NATO ally. And it's absolutely wrong to say that, in undertaking this operation, we are displacing civilians and we are, creating a security vacuum for the ISIS prisoners that are held captive to escape. This is not true. First of all, because we have the experience of doing these operations and we have the experience of fighting ISIS-Daesh more than any other member of the coalition, I might add, we're perfectly capable and we have the capacity to secure prisons and areas where ISIS captives are held. This is not a problem for us, but we have maintained that this is, even when they were secured by this terrorist organization, the YPG, this was a temporary solution. And previously I was on the BBC and a senior British analyst said the same thing. YPG manning these camps and prisons was always thought of by the West as a temporary solution. And he said in the medium to long term, we must come to an agreement in the international community as to what we're going to do with these people. And those that came from European countries need to return to their home countries. Now, of course, the European countries don't want them back, but what's going to happen to them? So this is not something that Turkey is going to deal with on its own. Yes, we can secure them. We can secure them much better than the YPG did, but we want a medium to long-term solution that is the responsibility of the international community.
Well, talking
for
about
these prisoners.
misinformation here, especially because there's been so much going on and so much said throughout the last couple of days, especially when it comes to the US observation post being hit.
Yeah.
So what are the facts there?
Well, what happened is, the area of operation, as I said, is very clear. Now, obviously, the intended zone also includes this town, Ain al-Arab. But we didn't initially start the operation in that area. As you know, we've started more from the middle of that strip of land across our border. But because the YPG, PKK were based there, they started firing and shelling at our towns just across the border. Now, this has been going on in other areas as well, and as you know, a number of our civilians, our citizens, have died because of the PKK shelling across the border, including a 9-month-old baby. So, they fire indiscriminately at civilians, this terrorist organization. And they started firing at Turkish positions, Turkish towns across the border from this Ain al-Arab place. Now, right next to that is an American-US observation post. We know exactly where it is. Our armed forces returned the fire that was, because they were attacking us from this area, but we did not fire on the US observation post. We did not target it. Now, the Pentagon, I think, have been saying that, some shells came near, but none of their soldiers were harmed. Yes, some shells could have fallen nearby. But Turkey did not deliberately target that US outpost. We were responding to fire from this area controlled by the YPG. Now, if the YPG are such so-called good allies of the United States, they should take care not to put US soldiers' lives at risk. So
when you're talking about those worries, one of them is civilian casualties. The
yes,
Western media has been reporting that the death toll is rising inside Syria. So what have you said to the US, as you said?
Exactly. Look, we've already done, as I said, 2 operations. We've been very careful not to avoid civilian casualties. And as I mentioned, the coalition were not so great at doing this. We have actually been much more careful than they are. When it comes to prisoners, we've been, we know how to deal with ISIS. But look at what YPG did in Raqqa. They actually complicitly came to an agreement with Daesh ISIS fighters and allowed them to be evacuated from Raqqa in thousands, and that was documented by the BBC. So, we know how YPG is not so great in dealing with Daesh, but they're spinning it in the Western media that these are the guys that can only fight Daesh. There's no one else to fight Daesh. Yes, there's no one else to fight Daesh when you have the 2nd largest army in NATO right next to you, which is Turkey. Who is really going to believe this rubbish? But this is exactly the kind of spin that they've been putting out over and over again. And people are beginning, unfortunately, to believe this. So, but the civilian casualties have been very careful. But the YPG, what they're doing is they're deliberately moving into areas where there are civilians. They always do this. And they try to use civilian areas so that, that they try to report civilian casualties. But we've recently been seeing things on social media where, they've been staged little videos coming from YPG where people are supposedly being killed, but then you see that it was all staged. And so there's a lot of misinformation in that regard as well. Obviously, this is a conflict, and it's very unfortunate that if people are caught in the fire,
and being used as human shields,
being used as bad things can happen. But we're actually watching it very, very carefully and trying to avoid this as much as we can, even though we're dealing with a terrorist group that has no regard for human life.
Well, coming to the Daesh fighters there, US President Donald Trump he criticised the European countries for not getting involved or taking them back. Yeah. So how many actually, because they've been saying different numbers of how many fighters are still remaining inside or in the hands of YPG. Yeah. So how many do we think is there, and what's the legal challenge with that?
The guess is about 2,000 foreign fighters are probably there in various prisons, and then there's about probably 10,000 fighters as a whole, could be less than that. But the majority of people, much higher number, are women and children, and they're being held, the families of ISIS-Daesh, they've been held in this Al-Hol camp, which is actually way outside our zone of operation. But the prisons, I think, we can safeguard those and take control of them, without any problems. The Daesh fighters that actually came from Europe, there we're on the same page with the Americans. Very few things that we agree on these days, but one of the things we do agree is that these foreign fighters need to go back. They need to be taken back by the European countries where they came from. And of course, not just European countries. I think there's fewer, of course, from lots of other countries as well around the world. But, we think that they should be tried in their own countries, and that it shouldn't be a matter of holding them indefinitely in Syria somewhere.
Well, coming to the last question here, which is, as you said, the aims of this operation is quite clear, with the Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has also made it very clear in New York at the UNGA, so saying that it wants to create a safe zone there for millions of Syrians to be able to go back. But that is a big challenge. What are the challenges ahead there?
The challenges ahead is that we really need, first of all, we need to clear that area from terrorism, from the YPG, as well as Daesh and ISIS. And captive Daesh ISIS have to be maintained in captivity in a secure environment. So that's the first priority. Then once we've created a secure environment for people who actually live there, the actual owners of the houses and villages and whatever there, to actually return. We know the YPG have destroyed so many Turkmen and Arab villages in that area. And this has been documented, actually not by us, but by Amnesty and the UN. So there's actually a lot of documentation internationally about the abuses that YPG have been conducting in that area. So we want these people to return, and once we ensure that return, initially, because we've done this in the 2 other operation zones, we can initially provide for, basic infrastructure to return and so forth. We have got the plans for that. We have got an estimate, and we would like the international community to shoulder that burden of recreating life back to normal in that area. So we're not going to be paying for that or footing the bill, but it should be of interest to everyone concerned, because there are nearly 4 million refugees in Turkey.
Which many haven't kept their promises when it came to the Syrian refugees from the international community.
We're not getting any support.
Do you believe this time they will?
Yeah, but the thing is, this situation it's not something that we're going to be able to deal with in the long run. And we shouldn't have to deal with in the long run. Now, this heads buried in the sand attitude coming from the EU that, Turkey's got the refugees, let's give them a little bit of money and let's contain the problem and let's not help them with North Syria, and in fact, let's condemn their operation in North Syria. I'm sorry, but this is against European interests. This is not a sustainable or wise policy, because you cannot contain this problem and expect Turkey to shoulder this problem all by itself. It's just not going to happen. It's as erroneous as the American policy to arm one terrorist group to fight another terrorist group. These policies are all going to hit a wall, like the American policy has. And when they do, I think the Europeans are going to wake up and say, okay, now we need to help Turkey do something in North Syria to relocate these people. Now, it's so easy to talk from the comfort of your home in Europe and say, oh, Turkey is going in there, this is a bad operation, they should stop, and they're changing the demographics, when you have no idea what this terrorist organization has done to all these villages with all these displaced people who have turned away from the YPG, who have fled the YPG and ISIS-Daesh, and we are looking after them. And I tell you, these people are Arabs, Turks, Turkmens, Kurds, and Christians, Syriac Orthodox Christians. And they've all fled their homes. We want them to return. And I think it's about time that the European Union just woke up, because this whole idea of the YPG are the good guys and we should support them, this is over. They cannot sustain this policy any longer. They really have to wake up to the reality that this is a terrorist organization which is an absolute threat to Turkey, and Turkey has taken matter into their own hands, and Turkey is not going to shoulder the burden of 4 million refugees indefinitely. It's about time people realize that.
Especially at a time when there are more people displaced in the Second World War.
Exactly.
Thank you very much,
Thank you very
Gulnur
much.
Aybet. It was a pleasure talking to you again.